The chamber where the Galactic Council met had walls made of crystal that showed the stars beyond. 17 species had built this place together, and for 10,000 years, they had kept peace among themselves. Captain Jevon of the Tyrellian fleet stood at attention as the council reviewed humanity's application for membership. Her silver skin reflected the light from the crystal walls, and her 4 eyes watched the human delegation with careful interest. The humans were young. They had only been traveling through space for 300 years, which was barely a moment compared to the ancient civilizations around them. But they had good technology, strong ships, and they wanted to join the council. Most species thought this was a good thing. More members meant more strength, more trade, more knowledge shared between worlds. Admiral Chun led the human delegation. He was an older man with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. When he spoke, his words were careful and measured. "We understand the council has rules about warfare," he said. "We're willing to learn your ways." Jevon had been assigned as humanity's military liaison. It was her job to teach them how civilized species fought their wars. The council had strict rules. No attacks on civilians. No biological weapons. No destroying entire planets. Wars were fought in space, ship against ship, with honor and restraint. When one side had clearly won, the other surrendered, and they worked out terms. Deaths were kept to a minimum. Mercy was always given. The humans agreed to everything. They signed the documents. They promised to follow the rules. But Jevon noticed something strange when she visited their military bases. The humans prepared for war differently than any species she had ever seen. They ran endless training exercises with scenarios that made no sense. What if the enemy didn't surrender? What if they targeted civilians anyway? What if mercy failed? The humans had plans for situations that would never happen because the council rules prevented them. They stockpiled weapons that seemed excessive. They maintained massive reserves of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and fuel, as if expecting wars to last for years instead of weeks. Why do you need all this? Jevon asked during an inspection of a human military warehouse. The building stretched for miles, filled with weapons and supplies. Admiral Chun walked beside her, his boots echoing on the metal floor. "Because we might need it someday. But the council has supply agreements. If you need something, other members will provide it." "What if they can't?" Chun asked. "What if supply lines are cut? What if we're alone?" Jevon's smaller eyes narrowed in confusion. "The council doesn't abandon its members. That's the point of the alliance." Chun stopped walking and turned to face her. "Captain, I don't doubt the council's intentions. But hope isn't a strategy. We prepare for the worst because we've lived through it." She didn't understand what he meant. The Tyrellians had been part of the council for 6,000 years. They had fought 3 wars in that time, all of them resolved within months with minimal casualties. War was terrible, but it was controlled. It was civilized. Over the following months, Jevon grew frustrated with the humans. They questioned every protocol. During joint exercises, they broke formation to pursue tactics that violated council doctrine. When she corrected them, they apologized but seemed unconvinced. Admiral Chun was always polite but distant, as if he was waiting for something she couldn't see. One day, during a heated meeting about human non-compliance with standard ship positioning, Jevon let her frustration show. "You prepare for war as if mercy doesn't exist," she said. Her voice sharp. Chun was quiet for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, his tired eyes meeting hers. "We prepare for war as if mercy won't save us. That's a terrible way to think. It's kept us alive." Jevon wanted to argue, but something in his tone stopped her. She had read about Earth's history. The humans had fought each other for thousands of years before reaching space. Their wars had been brutal, with entire cities destroyed and millions dead. They had used horrible weapons, employed terrible tactics, and showed cruelty that made her sick to read about. But they had also survived. Every time extinction threatened them, they had clawed their way back. Maybe that was why they couldn't let go of their paranoia. They had earned it through suffering. The argument was forgotten 3 weeks later when the long-range scanners detected something impossible. A fleet was approaching from the outer dark, moving through space at speeds that shouldn't be possible. The ships were organic, grown rather than built, and they numbered in the thousands. The Council's best scientists analyzed the data and came back with an answer that chilled every species to their core. The Devourers had returned. Jevon had heard stories about the Devourers as a child. Tales meant to scare young Tyrellians into behaving. They were supposed to be extinct, destroyed 5,000 years ago in a war that had cost the Council dearly. But the evidence was clear. The Devourers were real, they were alive, and they were coming. The Devourers didn't negotiate. They didn't take prisoners. They didn't have a culture or art or anything that made them similar to other species. They were a hive mind with one purpose: consume. They landed on worlds and stripped them of everything. Plants, animals, people, minerals, water, everything was absorbed into their biomass and used to create more Devourers. They left behind dead rocks floating in space. An emergency session was called. All 17 council members gathered, their representatives speaking in a dozen languages translated by computers. Panic was barely controlled. The Devourers were 3 months away from the outer colonies. Billions of lives were at risk. Admiral Chun sat in the human section, listening carefully. Jevon watched him from across the chamber. While other delegates shouted and argued, Chun was calm. He made notes on a tablet, his expression thoughtful. When the council finally asked the humans for their assessment, Chun stood. "We need to mobilize the entire fleet," he said. "Every ship, every weapon, every soldier. This isn't a council war. This is a survival war." "We understand the severity," the council head replied. "We'll follow standard protocols. Deep space engagement, precision strikes, minimal casualties on both sides." Chun's jaw tightened. "With respect, the Devourers don't have sides. They're not going to surrender. They're not going to negotiate. Standard protocols won't work. Then what do you suggest?" The chamber went quiet. Every eye turned to the human admiral. Jevon saw something in his expression that frightened her. It was the look of someone who had seen the abyss and knew what lived there. "Let us show you," Chun said quietly, "how humans fight when survival is the only thing that matters." The council agreed to consider his input. But Jevon could see they didn't really understand. They still thought this would be like their other wars. Controlled, civilized, resolved with honor. She knew better now. She had seen the human warehouses, the weapon stockpiles, the endless contingency plans. The humans had been preparing for this kind of war their entire history. And for the first time since joining the council, Jevon was grateful that humanity had never truly learned to be civilized. The council fleet assembled in deep space, far from any populated systems. Jevon stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Morning Star, and watched through the view screen as hundreds of ships moved into formation. It was the largest military force the Council had gathered in 1,000 years. Every member species had contributed their best vessels and most experienced crews. The plan was simple and followed all the standard protocols. They would engage the Devourers at maximum range, using precision weapons to disable their ships without destroying them completely. The goal was to force a retreat or, if necessary, eliminate the threat with minimal violence. The Council had fought wars this way for millennia, and it had always worked. Admiral Chun had requested that human ships be positioned differently, scattered throughout the fleet instead of grouped together. The Council had denied his request. Standard formation was standard for a reason. The humans reluctantly moved their ships to the assigned position on the fleet's left flank. Jevon had spoken with Chun the night before the battle. He had seemed resigned, almost sad. "You're making a mistake," he had told her. "The Devourers aren't like anything you've fought before." "We've studied the historical records," Jevon replied. "We know what they are. Knowing what they are and understanding what that means are two different things." Chen had paused, choosing his words carefully. "When we fought each other on Earth, we learned something important. You can't show mercy to an enemy that doesn't understand mercy. You can't follow rules against an opponent who doesn't acknowledge rules exist. Then what do? Chun's expression had been grim. "You do whatever it takes to survive, even if it costs you your soul." Now, watching the Devour fleet approach on the scanners, Jevon remembered those words. The enemy ships were massive and organic, their hulls made of something that looked like chitin and bone. They moved in swarms rather than formations, thousands of vessels flowing through space like a school of fish. The Council fleet had 3 times as many ships. The tactical computers predicted a 90% chance of victory with acceptable casualties. Everything was going according to plan. The battle began at 0800 hours. The Council ships opened fire with their precision weapons, targeting the Devour vessel's propulsion systems. It was textbook warfare, designed to disable rather than destroy. Jevon watched with satisfaction as the first wave of shots hit their targets. Then everything went wrong. Devour ships that were hit didn't stop or retreat. They didn't even slow down. Instead, they accelerated, driving straight toward the Council ships, even as their systems failed. The damaged vessels crashed into their targets like missiles, their organic hulls tearing through metal and composite armor. Explosions bloomed across the view screen as Council ships died. "They're using themselves as weapons," Jevon's tactical officer said, his voice shocked. More Devour ships forced forward. The Council fleet adjusted their targeting, trying to destroy the enemy vessels before they could ram the line. But for every Devour ship they destroyed, 2 more took its place. The swarm was endless. Jevon ordered her ships to fall back and regroup. The other Council commanders did the same. But the Devourers followed, their ships moving with frightening coordination. They didn't care about their own casualties. Every ship was expendable, every life meaningless to the hive mind that controlled them. The human ships on the left flank weren't falling back. Jevon saw them on her tactical display, moving forward instead of retreating. They had broken formation completely and were engaging the Devourers at close range, their weapons firing in patterns that ignored every safety protocol. Human ships deliberately positioned themselves between Devour vessels and Council ships, taking the ramming attacks meant for others. Admiral Chun's voice came over the fleet communication channel. "All Council ships, retreat to safe distance. Human fleet will cover your withdrawal." "Negative," Jevon replied. "We fight together or not at all. Captain, with respect, you don't know how to fight this enemy." "We do. Pull back now before you lose more ships." Jevon wanted to argue, but another explosion rocked her vessel. A Devour ship had gotten through their defenses and struck the Morning Star's port side. Alarms blared as atmosphere vented into space. Her crew scrambled to seal the breach. All across the battlefield, Council ships were dying. The Devourers pressed their attack with mindless efficiency, throwing ships at the fleet until the sheer mass of their assault overwhelmed the defenses. Jevon watched her tactical display as ship after ship blinked out of existence. Friends she had known for decades, crew she had trained with, all gone in moments. The human ships were taking terrible damage too, but they fought differently. When their weapons ran dry, they used their ships as battering rams, deliberately colliding with Devour vessels to destroy them. When their shields failed, they vented atmosphere as a weapon, creating frozen clouds that obscured the enemy's sensors. They fought with a desperation and creativity that the Council had never needed before, but it wasn't enough. The Devourers had too many ships, too much momentum. The Council fleet was being torn apart. All ships, full retreat. The Council head's voice came over the emergency channel. Fall back to the inner systems. This battle is lost. The surviving ships turned and ran. The Devourers didn't pursue. They had already won. They continued on their course toward the colony worlds. Their swarm barely diminished by the battle. Jevon made it back to Council space with her ship barely functional. 70% of the fleet had been destroyed in just 6 hours. Thousands of her people were dead, and they had accomplished nothing. The Devourers were still coming, and now there was almost nothing left to stop them. The emergency council session was chaos. Representatives shouted at each other in a dozen languages, blaming everyone and offering no solutions. The Devourers would reach New Terrelia in 2 weeks. 8 billion Terrellians lived on that world. Evacuation on that scale was impossible. The remaining council fleet couldn't win another conventional battle. Some representatives suggested surrender. Others proposed trying to negotiate, sending ambassadors to communicate with the Devourers. A few advocated abandoning the outer colonies and fortifying the core worlds. Admiral Chun sat quietly through it all, his face expressionless. He had lost ships too. Jevon had seen the casualty reports. 40% of the human fleet was gone. But Chun didn't look defeated. He looked like he was waiting. Finally, the council head turned to him. Admiral Chun, the humans have experience with this kind of warfare. What would you do? Chun stood slowly. The chamber fell silent. Every representative turned to look at the human. This representative of the youngest and least experienced species in the council. You fought them like they were you, Chun said, his voice carrying across the chamber. You showed mercy to an enemy that has no concept of it. You followed rules they don't acknowledge. Now you've lost your fleet, and the Devourers are coming for New Terrelia. We know the situation, someone shouted. Tell us your solution. Let us fight them our way. What way is that? Jevon asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Chun's tired eyes swept across the chamber. The way we fought each other before we knew better. The way that kept our species alive when extinction was always one bad harvest, one plague, one war away from wiping us out. The way that has no honor, no mercy, and no rules except one: survive. The council head's voice was quiet. What exactly are you proposing? Give me tactical command of the defense of New Terrelia. Let me use human methods, human tactics, human weapons. I can't promise you'll like what we do. I can't promise it will be clean or honorable. But I can promise you this. When it's over, those 8 billion Terrellians will still be alive. The chamber erupted in argument. Some representatives were outraged at the suggestion. Others were desperate enough to consider anything. Jevon watched Admiral Chun's face and saw no doubt there. Only grim determination. She thought about the battlefield. About watching her ships die while following protocols that meant nothing to the enemy. She thought about New Terrelia and the billions of people who would die if the council did nothing. She thought about what Chun had told her. Sometimes mercy won't save you. I support the human proposal, Jevon said, her voice cutting through the chaos. The Admiral is right. Our way failed. Let them try theirs. Other voices joined hers. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough. The council had called for a vote. It passed by the narrowest margin. Admiral Chun was given tactical command. As the session ended and representatives filed out, Jevon approached him. I hope you know what you're doing. So do I, Captain, Chun replied. Because if this doesn't work, there won't be a second chance. Jevon watched as he left the chamber, already speaking into his communication device, issuing orders in rapid succession. The humans were taking over the defense of New Terralia, and she had no idea what they were planning. She only knew that it would be nothing like the civilized warfare that the Council practiced. The humans were going to fight the way their species had always fought when survival was at stake, with every weapon they had, every tactic they knew, and without mercy. For the first time in her life, Jevon was truly afraid of what her allies might do. The transports arrived at New Terralia within 30 hours. Jevon watched from orbit as thousands of human ships descended to the planet's surface. They weren't military vessels. They were construction ships, mining equipment, and cargo haulers. The humans were bringing an entire industrial operation to the colony world. Admiral Chun had set up his command center in orbit, and he had invited Jevon to observe. She stood in the operations room watching the tactical displays with growing confusion. The human plan made no sense according to everything she knew about warfare. "You're not evacuating the population?" she asked Chun. "We are," he replied, gesturing to a display showing massive underground construction. "Just not off-world. There's no time to move 8 billion people. So we're moving them down instead of up." On the screen, Jevon could see enormous excavation machines digging into New Terralia's crust. They were creating vast underground chambers, bunkers that could hold millions of people. Human engineers worked alongside Terralian civilians, building life support systems and reinforcing walls with materials brought from human worlds. "The Devourers will just dig down and find them," Jevon said. "They won't have time." Chun pulled up another display. This one showed New Terralia's cities, factories, farms, and infrastructure. Red markers appeared on every structure. "We're rigging everything on the surface with explosives. Every building, every road, every piece of infrastructure that took your people centuries to build." Jevon felt her blood run cold. "You're going to destroy the entire planet?" "Just the surface. The crust will survive. The bunkers will survive. The people will survive." Chun's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing routine maintenance instead of the destruction of an entire world civilization. "The Devourers will come here expecting to find biomass and resources. Instead, they'll find a trap. This is insane. You're talking about setting off enough explosives to be seen from neighboring systems. The damage will be catastrophic. It will take generations to rebuild." "Yes," Chun agreed. "But there will be people alive to do the rebuilding. That's what matters." Over the next 10 days, Jevon watched the humans work with terrifying efficiency. They had clearly done this before, or at least planned for it. Every action was coordinated, every resource allocated with precision. The Terralian population was moved underground in waves, entire cities emptying as people descended into the bunkers below. The human soldiers who stayed on the surface planted their explosives with care. They weren't trying to destroy everything randomly. They were creating a specific pattern, a sequence of detonations that would maximize the destruction of the Devourer forces while minimizing damage to the underground shelters. Jevon went down to the surface once, to see what was happening with her own eyes. The cities were empty now, ghost towns waiting for their end. Human technicians moved through the streets, checking their work, making final adjustments. One of them, a young woman with red hair, nodded to Jevon as she passed. "Seems like a waste," the technician said, looking at the beautiful architecture around them. "But better this than letting those things have it." Jevon couldn't argue with that logic, but it still felt wrong. Civilized species didn't destroy their own worlds. They found better solutions, except there was no better solution. The Devourers were coming, and there was nowhere else for 8 billion people to go. The enemy arrived on schedule. Their fleet darkened the sky as thousands of organic ships entered New Terralia's atmosphere. Jevon watched from the command center as the Devourers descended eagerly. their sensors detecting the massive amounts of biomass on the planet's surface. They couldn't see that all of it was bait. The Devourer ships landed across every continent. Their forces poured out, millions of creatures that looked like insects mixed with nightmares. They spread across the empty cities, searching for the people who should have been there. Some of them began consuming the vegetation, the animals, anything organic they could find. Admiral Chun watched the displays with cold eyes. He was tracking the Devourer positions, waiting for the right moment. 90% of their ground forces had landed. Their fleet ships were low in the atmosphere, hovering over the major cities to collect the resources their ground forces would gather. They're in position, a human officer reported. Chun didn't hesitate. Detonate everything. The planet exploded. Not literally, but close enough. Every charge detonated simultaneously in a sequence that had been planned down to the microsecond. Cities vanished in fireballs. Factories exploded with enough force to create mushroom clouds. The fusion reactors that powered New Terrelia's infrastructure were overloaded and turned into weapons, adding their energy to the devastation. Jevon watched in horror as the planet's surface became a sea of fire. The explosions were so massive that they created their own weather patterns, generating winds that tore across the continents at supersonic speeds. The Devourer ground forces were incinerated instantly, millions of them dying in the first few seconds. The fleet ships in atmosphere fared even worse. The shock waves from the explosions tore through their organic hulls like paper. Ships broke apart and fell from the sky, adding to the inferno below. Some tried to escape, but the humans had positioned their own ships in orbit specifically to prevent that. Any Devourer vessel that made it to space was met with overwhelming firepower. The battle lasted 3 hours. When it was over, 90% of the Devourer invasion force was gone. New Terrelia's surface was a scorched wasteland, the beautiful cities reduced to ash and rubble. But deep underground, in the bunkers the humans had built, 8 billion Terrelians were alive. Jevon felt sick. They had won, but the cost was almost too much to bear. An entire world's infrastructure, centuries of development, gone in an afternoon. How can you live with this? She asked Chun. The Admiral looked at her with those tired eyes. Because the alternative was worse. The Devourers would have left nothing but stripped rock. At least this way, your people survive. They can rebuild. They can have children who will never know the Devourers existed. That's worth any price. But the war wasn't over. Intelligence reports came in over the following days. The main Devourer fleet was regrouping. They had lost their forward assault force, but they still had millions of ships. And now they were angry. Their next target was the agricultural world of Plenia, a planet that supplied food to a dozen systems. The Council wanted to evacuate Plenia, but Chun argued against it. If we abandon it, we lose the food supply. Billions will starve. We need to hold that world. How? Jevon demanded. We can't blow up every planet. Eventually, we'll run out of worlds to sacrifice. We won't need to. Chun pulled up a new display. This one showed biological data, genetic sequences, and chemical formulas that Jevon didn't understand. We've been working on something. A weapon that the Council banned thousands of years ago. Jevon's smaller eyes widened as she realized what she was seeing. Biological warfare. You created a plague. We engineered it specifically for the Devourers. It targets their hive mind neural structures, breaks down the connections that let them function as a collective. It's fast, fatal, and highly contagious within their species. It won't affect any other known life form. This is beyond acceptable. The Council will never approve this. The Council doesn't need to approve it. I have tactical command, remember? And I'm not asking permission. Chun's voice was hard. The Devourers are coming for Plenia in 4 days. I'm gonna stop them using every weapon humanity has ever created, including the ones you wish didn't exist. Jevon wanted to stop him, but she had no authority. The council had given Chun command, and he was using it. She watched helplessly as human ships carrying the biological weapon deployed to intercept the Devourer fleet. The battle at Plania was nothing like New Teralia. There were no explosions, no dramatic displays of force. The human ships simply released containers into space along the Devourer fleet's projected path. The containers broke apart, spreading microscopic particles that the Devourer ships passed through. At first, nothing happened. The Devourers continued toward Plania, their fleet intact and apparently unaffected. Then, slowly, their ships began to drift off course. The precise coordination that made them so dangerous started to break down. Ships collided with each other. Some stopped moving entirely. Others fired weapons randomly, hitting their own forces. The plague was working. The Devourer hive mind was collapsing, each ship becoming isolated and confused without the collective intelligence guiding it. Within 3 days, the entire fleet was dead or dying, floating in space like a graveyard. Human cleanup crews in hazard suits moved through the debris, methodically sterilizing every ship to prevent the plague from spreading. They were thorough and efficient, treating it like routine industrial work rather than the aftermath of a biological weapon attack. Jevon stood in the command center and stared at the screens showing the dead Devourer fleet. They had won. The threat was eliminated. Plania was safe. But she felt no joy, only a deep exhaustion and a growing sense of horror at what the humans had done. Admiral Chun approached her. "I know what you're thinking. That we're monsters. That we went too far, didn't you?" "Maybe," Chun admitted. "But your people are alive. 2 worlds, billions of people, saved because we were willing to do what you couldn't. You can hate us for the methods. You can call us barbarians. But everyone we saved gets to wake up tomorrow and live their lives." Jevon had no answer to that. The humans had saved them, but they had done it using tactics that violated everything the council stood for. And now she had to go back and explain to her government what had happened, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The war was over, but Jevon suspected the real conflict was just beginning. The council chamber had never been so full of anger. Representatives from all 17 species stood and shouted, their voices creating a wall of sound that made translation impossible. Jevon sat in her seat and watched as the civilization she had believed in tore itself apart over what to do about the humans. Admiral Chun stood in the center of the chamber, alone and surrounded by accusers. He didn't look afraid or apologetic. He just looked tired, as if he had known this moment was coming and had already accepted it. "You destroyed an entire world," the Plenty representative shouted, his tentacles writhing with rage. "You deployed weapons that were banned for good reason. You have shown us that humans cannot be trusted with power." "We saved your world," Chun replied calmly. "The Devourers would have stripped Plania down to bedrock. Instead, your people are alive and your farms are intact. At what cost? You released a plague into space. What if it mutates? What if it spreads to other species? It won't. We designed it specifically to prevent that. You can't guarantee that. No one can guarantee the behavior of biological weapons. That's why we banned them." The argument continued for hours. Species after species stood to condemn the human tactics. They called Chun a war criminal. They demanded that humanity be expelled from the council, arrested, tried, and punished. Some of the more extreme representatives suggested that human worlds should be quarantined, that the species was too dangerous to be allowed to interact with civilized societies. Through it all, Chun stood silent until he was directly addressed. He didn't defend himself beyond simple statements of fact. Yes, he had destroyed New Terrelia's surface, Yes, he had used biological weapons. Yes, he had violated nearly every rule the council held sacred. Jevon listened and felt torn in two directions. Part of her agreed with the other representatives. What the humans had done was horrible, barbaric. Everything that civilization was supposed to move beyond. But another part of her remembered the battlefield, remembered watching council ships die because they followed rules the enemy didn't acknowledge. Finally, the council had called for order. The chamber fell silent. Admiral Chun, you stand accused of war crimes against the principles of civilized warfare. How do you answer these charges? Chun was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried across the chamber despite not being raised. You asked us to save you. You didn't ask us to save you gently. You gave me tactical command and told me to stop the Devourers. I did exactly that. You could have found another way. No, Chun said firmly. I couldn't. Every species in this chamber has a history of barbarism. You've just had the luxury of forgetting it because you've been safe for so long. You've been part of the council for thousands of years, fighting wars against enemies who shared your values. But the Devourers don't share your values. They don't have values. They're a force of nature, and you can't negotiate with a hurricane. The Turellian representative stood. You speak of our history as if we should be ashamed of overcoming it. We evolved beyond brutality. We learned better ways. You learned better ways because you had time to learn them, Chun replied. Because your enemies gave you that time. Humans have only been spacefaring for 3 centuries. We remember what it cost to survive on our home world. The plagues that killed half our population. The famines that drove us to desperation. The wars where entire cities were erased. We didn't choose to be brutal. Brutality chose us, again and again, until we learned to wield it or die. Jevon found herself standing. She hadn't planned to speak, but the words came out anyway. I was at the first battle. I watched our fleet die because we fought with honor against an enemy that had none. Thousands of my people burned in space because we followed protocols that meant nothing to the Devourers. The council head turned to her. Captain Jevon, are you defending the human actions? I'm saying that I'm alive because of those actions. 8 billion Turellians are alive. The people of Plenia are alive. We're all here, in this chamber, breathing and arguing because the humans were willing to make the decisions we couldn't make. At what price? Someone shouted. If we become monsters to fight monsters, what are we? Chen's voice cut through the chamber. You're alive. That's what you are. You can debate philosophy and ethics and the proper way to wage war because you survived to have that debate. The dead don't get to argue about whether they died honorably. They're just dead. He walked forward, approaching the council head directly. Guards moved to intercept him, but the council head waved them off. Chun continued speaking, his tired eyes sweeping across the chamber. We used brutal tactics not because we're cruel, but because the alternative was extinction. You can hate us for the methods. You can expel us from your council. You can call us barbarians and refuse to ever speak to us again. But you'll do it breathing, on worlds that still exist, because we were willing to make the ruthless decisions you couldn't. The chamber was silent. Every representative was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They were only alive to judge. The humans because the humans had saved them. The council head called for a vote. Should humanity be expelled from the council and face trial for war crimes? The debate that followed was bitter and divided. Some species argued that principles mattered more than survival, that becoming monsters to fight monsters meant the Devourers had already won. Others argued that survival was the only principle that mattered when extinction was the alternative dot in the end. Humanity wasn't expelled. The vote was close, closer than any decision in council history. But enough representatives had decided that living with guilt was better than dying with honor. Humanity would remain in the council, but under permanent military oversight. Their methods would be classified and locked away, to be used only in the most extreme circumstances when no other option existed. It was a compromise that satisfied no one, but it acknowledged the reality that everyone wanted to ignore. Sometimes survival demanded more than honor. Days later, Jevon visited Admiral Chun as he prepared to return to human space. The humans were being reassigned to the outer territories, as far from Council core worlds as possible. It was a polite exile, a way for the other species to pretend the humans didn't exist until they were needed again. "I don't know if I can forgive what you did," Jevon admitted as they stood in the docking bay, watching human ships load supplies. Chen nodded slowly. "I don't know if I can forgive it either. I see those cities burning every time I close my eyes. I hear the casualty reports in my sleep. But we're both here to have that conversation, and so are 8 billion Turellians. That's going to have to be enough. Is it? Enough, I mean?" "No," Chum said honestly. "But it's what we have. War isn't glorious or honorable or any of the things your council likes to pretend it is. It's ugly and horrible, and it breaks everyone it touches. The only question is whether you're willing to be broken and still keep fighting when everything depends on it." Jevon watched as the last human ship prepared for departure. "What will you do now?" "Go home, train our soldiers, maintain our stockpiles, prepare for the next time someone needs us to be monsters." Chun smiled sadly. "Because there will be a next time. The universe is bigger than the council, and not everything out there plays by your rules." As the human fleet departed, Jevon stood at the viewport and watched them go. She felt a strange mixture of relief and regret. Relief that they were leaving, that the council could return to its comfortable illusions about civilized warfare. Regret because she knew Chun was right. There would be a next time, and when it came, they would need the humans again. She had learned something disturbing during the war with the Devourers. The humans hadn't taught the council how to be brutal. They had taught them that brutality had always been an option, lurking beneath their civilization like a buried weapon. The humans were just the only ones willing to dig it up when survival demanded it. Weeks later, Jevon received a classified message. The council was beginning a new project called the Last Resort Protocols. They wanted her to help develop tactical plans based on human methods, to be locked away in secure files and opened only when extinction was the alternative. They hoped they would never need them, but now they knew they could use them. Jevon accepted the assignment. She spent months working with human military advisors, learning their tactics, understanding their logic. It was horrible work that gave her nightmares. But she persisted because she understood something now that she hadn't before the war. Sometimes the most ruthless decision wasn't about how you fought. It was about being willing to survive at all costs, even if survival meant losing part of your soul. The humans had paid that price already, over and over throughout their history. They had shown the council that survival wasn't pretty or honorable or civilized. Survival was just survival. And when everything else failed, it was the only thing that mattered. The protocols were completed and sealed away in secure vaults across council space. Every species had access to them, but using them required unanimous agreement from all 17 members. It was a safeguard against casual brutality, a reminder that these methods were truly the last resort. Jevon hoped they would never be opened. But she slept a little easier knowing they existed, and that humanity had taught them the hard lesson they needed to learn. In a universe that doesn't care about your principles, sometimes you have to choose between your ideals and your survival. The humans had made that choice. They had survived, and they had saved everyone else in the process. Whether that made them heroes or monsters, Jevon still couldn't decide. Perhaps they were both. Perhaps that was the point.